Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why, and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of civil services examination. Today we have taken up daily edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 10th of July 2023. The articles that we shall discuss have been displayed on the screen. Let us now begin the discussion. The first article that we have taken has appeared as a column on page number 6. Dangerously fanciful. The Gujarat High Court has made defamation sound like a horrific crime. So the Gujarat High Court order declining to stay the conviction of Congress leader Rahul Gandhi in a defamation case is quite unreasonable and borders on the fanciful. Fanciful basically means over imaginative or even unrealistic, highly ornamental or imaginative in design. And so, as far as the views of the Hindu newspaper is concerned, they don't agree with the judgment to the extent that they are calling the judgment as highly unrealistic, not sounded in proper jurisprudence. But from the perspective of the civil services examination, it is important for us to understand what defamation is. Because in India, we understand that we have right to freedom of speech and expression, so we have right to say anything we want. But that is not the truth, because there are certain reasonable restrictions which have been imposed on our absolute right to freedom of speech and expression. And defamation or saying false statement to injure one's reputation is one of the restrictions on our free speech. We can't use the right to freedom of speech to say something bad and false, both. It has to be false and it has to injure others' reputation, and that is something that is not allowed in India's free speech regime. And so we are going to understand what are the different kind of defamation, mainly the civic and the criminal defamation. There are two kinds of it. While it could be a good idea to retain civil offense, but defamation or treating defamation as a criminal offense does not sound like a good idea. And so there are arguments both in favor and against that idea. We are going to understand both. So let us now begin the discussion.
Now, defamation, and especially the criminal component of defamation, appears in newspapers frequently, and most often than not, it appears because of misuse. It is used extensively by our political class against each other. It is used by industrialists against the activists, and most frequently, it is resorted by the state governments against the media persons. And hence, there is an ongoing debate as to whether there is a need for criminal kind of defamation in India or not. So, we'll first understand the whole scenario of defamation in our country, both in legal as well as in constitutional framework, through an argument between A and B. Now, first, let us understand what defamation means. Defamation is the general term for a legal claim involving injury to one's reputation caused by a false statement of a fact by someone else. So there are two crucial things in a defamation. Now, the first thing is false statement, and the second statement is the injury. So unless and until it is proven that the statement is false, the provisions of defamation will not kick in. So let's say this person A writes a blog in which he writes that a person B, who happens to be a public official, is extremely corrupt. Now, this is a statement. We don't know as of now that whether it is false statement or not, but definitely it is going to injure the reputation of B. And hence, as soon as B comes to know about this charge, she threatens A with a defamation case. Well, A was well aware of such consequences, and he was ready with a copy of Constitution of India, which he showed to Officer B, claiming that the Constitution of India, under right to freedom guaranteed by Article 19, has given him right to freedom of speech and expression. And he claims that he is utilizing the rights given to him under Article 19A of the Constitution of India, which are a part of fundamental rights and they are inviolable. Now, B, being a public official and having already cleared the civil services examination, knows her rights and obligations quite well. She knows that A has only read Article 19.1, which gives the right to freedom, and not Article 19.2, which provides for exceptions or reasonable restrictions on those rights. And she opens up the same copy of Constitution of India which A has and shows him the language of Article 19.2. Nothing in subclause A of Clause 1, which was shown by A to defend his right to speech, shall affect the operation of any existing law or prevent the state from making any law insofar as such law imposes reasonable restrictions on the exercise of the rights conferred by the said subclause in the interest of, which obviously A is not able to understand the complicated and convoluted language. She simplifies by saying that if any law deals with the sovereignty and integrity of India, the security of the state, friendly relations with foreign states, public order, decency, morality, or in relation to contempt of the court, defamation, or incitement to an offense, such laws shall not be considered as a violation of freedom of speech and expression. So the joke is on A if he thinks that his right to freedom of speech also protects the right to defamation. Not only that, judgments of Supreme Court have also included a right to reputation of an individual as a part of protection of life and personal liberty. And finally, moving on to the claim made by A, B says that you will be defended from defamation if you are able to prove that I am corrupt. But there is no FIR or investigation going on against me, and hence your claim is false. And it is for these very particular reasons the provisions of defamation exist in our country. So to sum it up, the arguments of A revolves around Article 19(1)(a), under which all the citizens of the country have right to freedom of speech and expression. Whereas B's arguments are based on the fact that there are reasonable restrictions which have been provided in the Constitution of India. Then Article 21, which encompasses right to reputation, and truthfulness of claim is the most important fact to evade defamation cases. And finally, both agree that the arguments put forward by B are more compelling and constitutionally and legally more tenable as compared to A, and hence the cases can be filed. Now the question arises that what kind of defamation case is B going to file on A? He asks B what kind of case or how is it going to be filed? And then she explains that in India, defamation is of two kinds, civil offense as well as a criminal offense. Now, civil offenses means that there are going to be damages and penalties in monetary terms. Whereas when the defamation is filed in the form of criminal case, then although it is bailable and non-cognizable and compoundable, but if proven right, it can lead to the punishment of up to 2 years. And this is done from the provisions of Section 499 and 500 of Indian Penal Code. So we'll understand them one by one. Now, under criminal law, a bailable offense is one where the accused has the right to seek bail, and non-cognizable means that police has no authority to arrest a person for a crime on its own without the prior approval of a court. Whereas the cognizable offenses are those offenses in which the police suo motu takes cognizance of crime and also does not need the approval of a court. So criminal defamation is non-cognizable. Unless and until court orders, the person, in this case A, cannot be arrested. Now, and compoundable means that offenses where the complainant, or in this case B, who is the one who has filed the case, can enter into a compromise and agrees to have the charges dropped against A. Those are compoundable offenses. So you can understand that contrary to civil defamation, criminal defamation is extremely heinous because it provides for punishment just on a basis of a person making a statement whether true or false. And so a debate has emerged in the last 2 decades whether to get rid of this criminal defamation or not. Now in this case, B decides to file a criminal defamation against A because she thinks that she is a very clean and upright officer. And the blog written by A has gone viral and there has been incalculable loss to her image and the criminal case is filed. Now since A is a blogger, he can't help but to write another blog. And what he has done is that he has gone through all the literature available which deal with the matters related to criminal defamation. And he has summarized all those arguments against the existence of criminal defamation into 3 points. Now, first and foremost, he found out in his research that defamation in form of a criminal case is against the global trend because most democracy and especially the advanced one have gotten rid of the criminality of the defamation. For example, US has removed the criminal defamation at the federal level. Similarly, in 2011, the Human Rights Committee of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights called upon states to abolish criminal defamation, and strongly observed that it intimidates citizens and makes them shy away from exposing the wrongdoings. And A claims that this is exactly what is happening with him as well. When he read newspapers, he found that more often than not, the provisions of the criminal defamation are misused in Indian system because often the prosecutor's complaint is taken at face value by the courts, which send out routine notices for the appearance of defendants without any preliminary examination whether the offending comments or reports come under one of the exceptions spelled out in section 499 or not. And hence the process itself becomes the punishment because the defendant, or in this case A, will have to go and appear in the case every time the court instructs him to be there. And finally, when the case will come to an end, it will be already a decade. Then A observes a very interesting phenomena in India, in which the public officials utilize the state machinery to fight their own case. So, for example, in this example which we are looking at, B is a public official and A, as a person, has written a blog specifically against an official B, that she is a corrupt in her individual capacity. But when the B will file defamation against A, her case will be fought by the public prosecutor who are paid by the state governments. This makes it extremely easy for the public officials to file defamation cases because they don't have to incur the costs of the cases. And then finally, a lot of cases are filed by groups at various locations in the country. Because the law can be used by groups or sections claiming to have been hurt or insulted and abuse the process by initiating multiple proceedings at the same time in different locations. And hence, the defendant has to go through the legal cases at each and every court wherever the cases have been filed. Then there are a lot of people who argue that public order is a big concern in the country. And a lot of time, these defamatory and false statements lead to public order disruptions. And hence, it is important for us to keep these criminal provisions. But then A has already done his research and he says that defamatory acts that may harm public order are covered by sections 124 and 153 and 153A, and hence it obviates any need to retain the provisions of criminal defamation just to serve the purpose of public order. So A has made extremely compelling arguments to defend his case. And since his blog is public, is read by B, who then comes up with her own set of arguments, making a case that criminal defamation should stay. Now, first and foremost is that B claims that there is extreme poverty and income inequality in a country like India. And hence, if we remove criminal defamation, then we will have to resort to civil defamation. But people do not have enough money to pay. Since the damage which your blog has done to my reputation is incalculable, I will have to resort to damages of 100 crore or maybe 10 crores. But simply, people do not have enough money to pay back, and hence the only way people can be threatened from making false claims against others is by fear of imprisonment. And the second is that since the internet has arrived and a lot of activism goes on in internet, which provides extreme anonymity to the content creators. And there is also no system of censorship on internet. B writes that in earlier times where there were newspapers, the editors were held accountable for whatever was printed in their newspapers. And by that way, it was ensured that no paper comes up with any false claims. And whenever an allegation is made, then that allegations were made on extremely verifiable facts. But now in the era of social media, internet and Twitter, there is no such accountability mechanism. And hence the only way to forestall such false claims is to induce the fear of imprisonment. And then finally, B says that section 499 has already been amended a lot of times and it already includes a lot of exceptions. And these exceptions and explanations included in Article 499 provide enough space and freedom for a person to not only make truthful claims but to also criticize other people, companies, parties, and groups of. So finally, to sum it up, Article 19.2 provides for exception to freedom of speech and expression, and in that, defamation is clearly mentioned. Section 499 and 500 of Indian Penal Code provide for criminal defamation. There are extremely valid and rational arguments both for keeping criminal defamation as well as abolishing it.
The second news article that we have taken has appeared on page number 2 of the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper. But I'm pretty sure that the news related to floods would appear everywhere across the country in this month.
Now, this is August, and this is the peak season of rainfall, especially in the northern parts of our country. And so, this happens to be the flood season as well. And so, what you will get, especially with respect to environment news, is just flood and flood and flooding, be it about urban areas or it about in general flooding. Now, disasters find their place in two papers separately. There is this GS paper 1 where you have disasters, and then we talk about GS paper 3 where you have disaster management along with disasters as well. And so look at this question in 2016. Major cities of India are becoming more vulnerable to flood conditions, discuss. There have been two other questions on floods as well. And all of them either deal with the causes of flood, the consequences of flood, or how to manage the floods. And so in this regard, we will initiate the discussion by first understanding exactly what flood is. Then of course we need to understand how is it caused, dealing into both man-made as well as natural causes. Then we will delve into the impacts, both positive, negative, and finally we will learn how to do long-term as well as immediate short-term management of floods. Let us now begin the discussion. Alright everyone, let us now begin right from the basics. What exactly is flood? How are we going to define flood? So if you have to give single line definition, you can clearly say that flood is a situation where the overflow of water, natural water, leads to the submergence of areas which are normally or in normal situation dry land. And so to give you a more clear explanation, I would like your focus to be on this particular diagram. This is a river channel, and with the general understanding of geography, we know that rivers tend to form something which is known as natural levees. So you have a river flowing and you have natural levees which sort of act as natural dams to prevent some of the water from overspilling on the floodplain. And so a flood is a situation where the water level breaches these natural levees level and submerges the area surrounding these natural levees. That is how a flood is defined. And why does that happen? Now, river is just like a pipe. You can imagine a pipe with a fixed capacity to hold water, which is also known as discharge of the river. So when the discharge of the river overshoots its capacity, overshoots the capacity of the river channel to accommodate that water, then you have a condition of spillage which is also known as flood. Okay, so I presume that all of us now understand what a flood or a flood-like situation is. And so the next natural question that would arise in your mind is, what causes flood? What are the reasons behind the flooding? And so if you analyze all the causes across the world, they can be distributed either towards the left side of this particular equation or towards the right side of this particular equation. So for example, if there is a sudden cloudburst which results in massive rainfall in a very short period of time, then of course you have a massive increase in the discharge or the flow of the river, while there has been no change in the capacity of the river channel to hold that extra water. And so where does that extra water going to go? It is of course going to spill over, right? So that is the left side of the equation. What about the right side of the equation? And so to give you another example, all of us know that deforestation takes place, especially in mountainous regions. This leads to the increased supply of sediments. And so as the amount of sediments keeps on increasing, where do you think the sediment is going to settle? It is going to settle on the river or inside the river channel. And as more and more sediments settle down, the capacity of this particular river channel to hold the water reduces, because there is just not enough space to accommodate the water, because a lot of space has been taken by sediments. And so as the capacity of the river channel to hold the water reduces, then again you have spillage with the same amount of discharge. So now this is just to demonstrate it to you that floods can be either caused due to the increase in discharge of the river due to various factors which we will discuss, or it can be due to the reduction in the capacity of the river channel to hold the water. But when you are appearing for civil services mains examination, you cannot just leave a question on causes of flood to this particular diagram and this equation. You need to be very solid on the causes. And so the overall factors which actually cause flood can be distinguished on two main broad parameters. One is man-made cause and the second one is natural causes. And let us now discuss them one by one.
And so let us now begin with natural causes first. The causes which have always been there and humans or any other particular species has known. So as we can easily understand, one of the biggest causes of floods as far as natural causes are concerned is heavy precipitation. Now as all of us understand that India receives around 80% of overall rainfall in around 4 months period. That is when you have southwest monsoon visiting our country. You know that rainfall over India does not falls equally everywhere. It shows a lot of variation. The reasons could be many. At some places, the reasons are orthographic or related to the altitude, because of which you have extremely high and dense rainfall happening over a very short period of time. Or in certain areas, you have cloudbursts, or you have rain bearing systems, or otherwise known as cyclones. And the areas where they visit, they have very high rainfall over a very short period of time. And so what it essentially does is that it increases the discharge of the river very rapidly, and since the volume of the river channel is not increasing, it's not just sufficient to hold that water, and it causes flood. So all those regions shaded with blue color face the problem of flood because of heavy precipitation. Then after heavy precipitation, you have another natural cause which is known as deposition. We know that as the rivers flow along, they take along themselves sediments because they erode either the riverbed or the sides of the river. Now when we talk about the deposition on the riverbeds, that is mainly due to the erosion and the eroded material which the river has brought from the mountainous regions. When we talk about its major cause, it's mainly river over there. But when we talk about deposition at the mouth of the river, this particular phenomena happens mainly because of sea tides and waves interacting with the river. Because what sea waves and tides do is that they dampen the capacity of the river water to take the sediments inside the seas and oceans. And so what happens is basically all the sediment just gets deposited or abandoned just at the mouth of the river, leading to high deposition rate, which then reduces the capacity of the river to hold the water. Then a lot of times the river changes its normal course. When the river changes its normal course, so what happens is that when river changes its normal course of flow, suddenly it leads to the spill of water in those areas which were earlier drier. One of the most important causes of floods, especially in higher up in Himalayas, is landslides. Regular and frequent landslides blocks the flow of the river, and so what you essentially have is the stark reduction in the capacity of the river to hold water, and the extra water just spills over. So by blocking the stream, landslide causes immense flooding. So these are the natural causes of floods, especially in India, and they have always been there. They have always existed and caused flood. But what we see now is massive increase in the frequency of floods, and the real reason behind them is the man-made factors, which are now increasingly playing greater role in causing the floods. And first and foremost man-made cause behind floods is settlements in floodplains. And this is a major reason behind floods in urban areas. And now in order to understand this, let us see this example. This is a river which is surrounded by natural levee, of course, and just adjacent to it is an area which is known as river's floodplain. And this is called a floodplain not without a solid reason. It is called a floodplain because this surrounding 100 to 200 meters of land is known to be inundated by river every year, and that happens. That is a natural process. But due to increase in the density of population in urban areas, what we do is that we move into these floodplains and make our houses, our colonies over there, where they are not supposed to be. And so when naturally the rivers flow rise, it leads to the inundation of surrounding areas, causing massive devastation and what gets highlighted as urban flood. Then, as if the settlements in floodplains was not enough, we have started destroying our natural wetlands. And this has been the topmost reason in causing floods in Chennai as well as in Srinagar. You know what wetlands do? Wetlands are natural absorbers of water. So you must have read about these wetlands with reference to, of course, Ramsar Convention and wetland of international importance. Now, wetlands are not just important for biodiversity, they are equally important for water conservation and prevention of flood as a disaster. But they also solve the problem of drought at the same time, because these wetlands are not just water bodies, not just like any other pond. They are sponges. They are sponges, they absorb the extra water as and when the need arises. And so they have this natural tendency to absorb much more volume of water than anybody else can do. And so when a city or an urban area receives water well beyond its drainage capacity, these wetlands used to come very handy. But what we have done in last 2 to 3 decades, we have started encroaching upon these wetlands, settling down human settlements, making colonies, and so what we have is stark reduction in not just the area but also in the number of wetland inside the urban areas. And so now where does this extra flood water goes into? It has nowhere else to go in an urban area, and so that is now causing floods. Also, at the same time, we have concretized the whole structure. There is no soil in the urban areas, there are just roads and then there are buildings. And so the water cannot go downwards into groundwater. And so that is another factor which adds on to the cause of flood. Then after these important reasons, there is another very important reason, which is deforestation. And deforestation is not simple cutting down of trees and you are done. Once you cut down massive amounts of trees, especially in mountainous areas, you have a lot of problem that you have created for human civilization. First and foremost, by cutting down trees, you have ensured that you have reduced the water holding capacity of the soil, especially in mountainous areas, by a great extent. And so if the extra water is not being recharged in the aquifers, of course it is going to flow down in streams, which is going to cause floods. Then by cutting down so many trees, you have ensured a great extent of carbon emission into the atmosphere, which is going to cause global warming, which is then going to melt the glaciers, and then it will increase the runoffs in the river, causing massive floods. And then of course, as every one of us have understood, that by cutting down trees, you have made sure that more and more soil particles flow into the river, which makes the river water sort of heavy, which slows down the flow of the river. And as the water flow slows down, it spills over and it causes floods. And so after this, we come to the latest addition to the man-made causes is dam management. And you have to understand that dam management is extremely crucial part of flood management. And let us just understand that very quickly. So let's say if this is a river and here we dam this river and there is a massive buildup of water in the reservoir we have created. And now we know that most of these dams get old with time, and their infrastructure, their walls might collapse, and this has happened. And so when this happens, all of that water, the massive reservoir, will immediately flow into the river, and river will not simply be able to hold on to this water, and it will cause massive flood. Then dam management also involves the proper and the timely opening up of gates, because the water is kept in these reservoirs by shutting the doors. When the flow of the river from upstream of the river increases, you have to open that gate. Now, the problem in India is that the weather forecasting is not up to the level which can predict when to open the gates and when to shut the gates. And more often than not, our weather forecasting is such that it takes a lot of time, or you can say a lot of time has been wasted. By the time the gates are opened, it's already too late, and so this massive build of water is released downstream, causing flood over there as well. So now, after dealing with what flood is, what causes flood, it's time to understand what impacts do floods have. And so floods just do not have negative impact on us or in our society, they also have some beneficial advantages as well. For example, the fresh sediments brought in and deposited on the floodplains by a flood enriches the soil with new nutrients eroded from up in the mountains, and so it increases the soil fertility. Flood is actually very important for wetlands, because then it is like a natural yearly recharge of water for them, which is very important for survival of our biodiversity, which are crucially dependent on these wetlands. And floods, especially in rural areas, leads to a recharge of groundwater in a big way. Of course, in urban areas, the concretization of the surface ensures that not much water flows inside, but in rural areas it's all just farms, and so there a lot of recharge takes place there. So these are the advantages of flood. If you can think of any other advantage, let me know in the comment box. But at the same time, we call flood a disaster. And so, if we categorize it as a disaster, it has to have higher level of disadvantages. And so overall negative impact of these floods can be categorized into socio-economic and political categories. And so first and foremost is loss of life and property, which is not very difficult to think of. And so what you have is either the crops are destroyed, or if there are stocks, they are submerged and there is of no use. They will just rot. And then you have animals dying because when the people leave because of flood, they do not have enough conveyance to take these animals along with them. And so they are just left to die over there. Of course, everyone can think of impact of floods on infrastructure. Due to floods, the transportation infrastructure, especially the road and railway, is disrupted, and submergence of an area leads to complete power cut. Then flooding, of course, causes mass migration of people, at least until the time when their homes are flooded with water. Of course, most of the residents come back to their original homes, but life never remains the same simply because their farm produce have been destroyed, they do not have any proper transport infrastructure, and so it takes long time until when the life return back to the normal. And the last social problem that you face in areas which were just visited by flood is disease outbreak immediately following the floods. Increasing the water level, especially in urban areas, leads to the flooding of sewage lines as well. And what it does is that the sewage lines and all the sewer comes onto the surface and keeps on floating and mixes with the drinking water. Eventually that drinking water is supplied to homes after the floods, which causes the outbreak of cholera, and then you also have problem of dengue and malaria as well. So these are the socio-economic problems. And let us now focus our attention towards political impacts of recurring floods. In the immediate aftermath of a flood, there is a lot of public discontent in the population because the government was not able to do just enough either to prevent the flood or to provide proper relief during the flood. And then, as we have said, since these factors do not change, floods eventually become recurring phenomena, which ultimately turns the public discontent into loss of trust towards the government, which is quite dangerous for a democracy. States like Assam and Bihar, which are visited by floods every year on year, lag far behind other states as far as development is concerned. Of course, there are other reasons behind this disparity, but floods as a major cause cannot be ignored because every year floods decimate your crop, they take away whatever you have done for infrastructure, they leave you reeling with disease, and so this is one of the causes behind stark regional disparity that we observe in India. And so after having discussed the impacts, let us now discuss the flood map. Now first and foremost, you should know that the primary responsibility of handling a flood lies on state government. And so that is why you see such a varied response when it comes to flood. Whereas the main responsibility of the central government is all about financially and logistically supplementing or supporting the state government in their efforts to counter the floods. The central government can provide NDRF forces, the central government can provide funds, but ultimately the ground action has to be taken by the state governments. And so when it comes to management, it can be divided into two parts. One is the immediate management or response towards a flood, and the second one is about long-term measures which reduce the probability and the damage which a flood can do in a long term. And so, of course, immediate actions are not very difficult to think of. You have to provide immediate relief to the people impacted by floods. It could be in form of cash distribution to help them sustain for the while they are away from home. It could also mean supplying food packets to them so that they can feed not just themselves but also their families. There is always a need for evacuation of the population. At the same time, you have to cater to their medical demands and make sure that the medical care they get is of right kind. But these are the measures which should be taken in the eventuality of a flood. But how about reducing the probability of flood itself? What we need to do for that? And those are more important steps, right? And so these are the 6 main steps which should be taken in order to solve this problem in a long-term manner. Starting with mapping of flood-prone areas in our country. So if I have to put in very simple terms, it means that you have to designate those areas which are liable to floods, which have high probability of floods visiting those areas. And so the government of India has already done this exercise, but just on macro level, which means on district level, on a much larger level. But more often than not, it's not the whole district which is flooded, but there are smaller pockets within those districts, even smaller than tehsil or a ward, which are flooded again and again, year on year. And so what we need now is micro-zonation mapping, keeping the floods in mind. We need our surveyors to go to each and every point in our country, especially in urban areas, and find out whether they are sitting or they have been built on a floodplain or not. What will be their situation if the river level goes up? And that is what we need right now. Once we have done the microzonation, then we need to control the land use according to the microzonation. The government needs to be very, very strict that if this is a floodplain, no means no. No settlement means no settlement. There would be no houses in the floodplain. Currently, these regulations are not well enforced in our urban areas. Then we need to curb the rate at which we are deforesting our jungles. Of course, we have done a great job in it, but we need to go even further. Then we need to rejuvenate the wetlands, and then it is derived again from the land use control. You need to identify the wetlands first, designate them as no construction areas, and protect them. Then as far as dam management is concerned, it needs to be scientific. That is, it needs to be based on proper satellite data and communication, and it has to be coordinated because there are series of dams on a river. And if the opening of the gates is not coordinated, you're going to cause flood at some point downstream the river. And then finally, you have something which is going to give solution to a lot of problems that we face today, and that is interlinking of river. By interlinking rivers, what you're going to do is that you're going to supply the surplus to deficit regions, solving the menace of floods up to a great extent. So this discussion becomes very, very important from the perspective of mains examination, where you could be expected to know about the causes of the flood, what are the impacts of the floods, and how to manage floods both in long as well as in short period of time. Let us now move on to the next discussion. The next article for discussion has appeared on page number 6, Restoring the World Trade Organization's Crown Jewel. So in June 2022, the member countries of WTO managed to hammer out a face-saving deal, and India played a vital role at the Geneva Ministerial Conference, thereby keeping faith in trade multilateralism alive. Now, in this sentence, a lot of things would not be making sense to you. For example, what is multilateralism? And so if you want to know about multilateralism, you can watch another DNS where we have discussed the concept of multilateralism and what are the threats to it. But if you don't want to watch that video, you can simply understand it to be an institution which is created as a result of 3 or more nations coming together to form an institution. So WTO is a multilateral institution, UN is a multilateral institution, WHO is a multilateral institution. And so this article mainly focuses upon the dispute settlement system or DSS of the WTO, which had been dysfunctional for quite a long time. And this has actually created a major hurdle in the path of the countries taking WTO seriously. But nothing of that will make sense to you unless and until we go through a discussion. Now, why is it important for civil services examination? Now, if you have seen the syllabus of GS paper 2, you must have seen an important line. Important international institutions, agencies and fora, their structure, mandate. And so in this regard, not just for the prelims examination, obviously this is important for that, but from the perspective of mains examination, there are few things which are very important. And so in this regard, we will start by first understanding why is there a need for such an international organization. Why in the backdrop of World War II, a need was felt for that, GATT was created, and then finally WTO took it from there. So we'll understand the basics of WTO, its advantages, and then finally we will look into the challenges currently being faced by WTO. Now starting with the basics, because most of our viewers are quite new and for them it is very, very important to understand how and why it was created. So before WTO there existed a GATT or General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It more or less functioned on the same lines, which was created in 1948 to regulate world trade. And it was created as a means to boost economic recovery after Second World War by reducing and eliminating trade tariffs, quotas and subsidies. So during the Great Depression, a breakdown of international relations and an increase in trade regulation made poor economic condition even worse, and it contributed to the outbreak of Second World War. And just as the war finished, allies believed that a multilateral framework for the world trade would loosen the protectionist policies that defined 1930s. Now, what are the protectionist policies and what are these tariffs and quotas and subsidies? So these are a way to carry out protectionism, which is a practice of following protectionist state policy, which allows for the government of a country to promote its own domestic producers, service providers, and thereby boost their domestic production of goods and services. For example, let's say if there is a government contract, and if government of India mandates that only Indian companies can bid for that contract, that is a kind of protectionism. Similarly, let's say that government of India puts a limit on how much cars can be imported, let's say 100 per year, that is a quota. Similarly, government of India can impose, let's say 100% import duty on a lot of products, and that is tariff. Or in other ways, the government of India can provide domestic producer of cars 50% rebate in, let's say, iron and steel. And so that is a subsidy. And so all these kinds of measures are called protectionist policies. So the taxes or duties imposed on imports are known as tariffs, restriction on the volume of import are known as quotas, and negative taxes or tax credits are known as subsidies. So these are the three main ways of providing protection. And let us understand them by an image which you can see on your screen. So these are tariffs. Then government provides subsidies which allows producers to lower the price of local goods and services because they are getting benefits from the government. Then you impose quotas. And then no matter how low a fee sets the price through subsidies, it cannot ship more goods because there is a limit on how much you can import. And even if that good is very cheap, you cannot import more than that. And then finally, you tweak with the currency. Deliberate attempt by a country to lower its currency value, which would make its exports cheaper and more competitive. So in the build-up of World War II, most developed countries across the world increasingly resorted to these four methods, and because of which the global trade was suffering, because protectionism has its own fair share of disadvantages. Of course, it offers more growth opportunity, lower imports, more jobs and higher GDP for the local population or for the residents of the country. But in the longer term, it is not good for any economy. Why? Because first and foremost, it leads to stagnation of technological advancement. As domestic producers don't need to worry about foreign competition, they have no incentive to innovate or spend resources on R&D of new products. Similarly, there is very limited choice for consumers. If you ask your parents about the choices they had about electronics goods or even cars, they would tell you that they were not available because consumers have access to fewer goods in a market as a result of limitations on how much foreign goods can be imported because of protectionist policies. There is increase in prices due to lack of competition. Consumers will need to pay more without seeing any significant improvement in the product. And since there are very less number of choices, consumer has to choose what is available. And finally, it leads to economic isolation. Because there are high tariffs, there are quotas, and there are subsidies given to local markets and local producers, that country or that economy becomes to grow increasingly distant from other economies, and so the exchange of ideas is minimum, and which leads to not just economic but also political and cultural isolation. Just try to think of North Korea when you talk about protectionism. It's just not economically isolated but also culturally and politically. And so that is why a need was felt to create an organization which would counter protectionism, would liberalize trade by reducing tariffs and removing quotas among member countries. This will not just counter protectionism but increase in global trade, which would then boost the war-ravaged economy of World War II scenario. And so in this context, GATT was thought of. Ultimately, it was taken over by WTO later on, but this is the context in which WTO works. So far, we have understood why it is important to have a global institution working towards a global trade or a rule-based trading system. So some important aspects of WTO is that it was established in 1995 or rather it took over or changed its form from GATT to WTO, and it is a successor of that, and it deals just not with goods, which was the main emphasis of GATT, but it deals with services, intellectual property, dispute settlement, as well as trade monitoring. An important aspect is that it is not a specialized agency of United Nations. Although it has an arrangement with the United Nations through which it maintains strong relation with United Nations. So this is a very important information. And so WTO functions for smooth, free and predictable global trade, or for the creation of free trade, which is a policy that means governments do not charge people to import or bring in goods from other countries or make exporter pay taxes to send their goods abroad. Because you need to understand that when companies invest in other countries, they want the trading rules to not change suddenly in their disadvantage. And for that, they need protection. And so that framework is provided by WTO. And so it is important for us to understand and appreciate the advantages which are derived from WTO. So first and foremost is that it talks about a gradual reduction of tariffs. As you can clearly see the example of United States on your screen. On your y-axis we have tariffs as a percentage of imports, and on x-axis you have years. And if you start looking from 1940, you can clearly see a gradual reduction in the import duties imposed by United States. And similar is the case with other countries as well. And so it talks about gradual reduction of tariffs, and through which it wants to promote free trade. Then it acts as a legal framework, not just for negotiation of countries or among them, but also for other kinds of trade barriers as well. Then it enables trade without any discrimination, and it is not like that WTO is just a body vouching for free trade or completely free trade, which means no tariffs, no barriers, no quotas, nothing. It allows for tariffs and trade restrictions under certain conditions. For example, if a country A feels that a country B is exporting very cheap raw material which is artificially deflated, then the country A can impose duties without violating WTO rules. Similarly, there are clauses such as national security which a country can utilize to impose significant barriers to trade for a specific country. And then finally, all these rules are to protect fair competition, because there are rules which member countries have to abide by. Whether it is about subsidies or contracts or import or export, once you become a member of WTO, your national rules have to align by the general framework. And so that is how the disadvantages of protectionism are countered. It leads to lower prices for consumers because then imports become cheaper. It promotes fair trade because then foreign companies can function in any of the countries which are member and can expect a fair treatment from the government. Then it leads to specialization, because when all companies are treated equally, then the companies can produce a product anywhere across the world. And that location is mainly decided by the factor of manufacturing cost and not other policies like quotas and tariffs and other barriers. And finally, it leads to the development of economies of scale, because by encouraging free trade, firms can specialize and produce higher quantity. This enables even more economies of scale, which is important for industries, especially in the current context. And the success of WTO is demonstrated by the raw data. WTO has over 160 members representing 98% of world trade. There has been an increase in the trade dispute which have been brought to WTO, showing that WTO indeed has become a forum to help resolve these disputes. Also, WTO regulations have helped avoid a major trade war. And finally, let's see the data. So on your screen, this graph shows world exports as a percentage of GDP. So on the y-axis, you have exports of goods and services as a percentage of GDP, and on x-axis, you have timeline, and you can clearly see an increasing trend throughout. So this clearly shows increasing global trade in last 50 years since the time a global rule-based order was established in global trade. Despite all its advantages, there are some issues, and they are significant ones. There are a lot of areas where WTO has been severely criticized On one hand, it is true that it has led to counter protectionism, but on the other hand, it is also true that it has given rise to inequalities, not just in terms of wealth, but also in terms of industrial and other kinds of development. Let us understand how. So, first and foremost criticism of WTO is that it is unfavorable to developing nations because it is derived from GATT, which was established in the context of World War II, and all the victors and the global north came together to frame a rule which was very beneficial to them. For example, let's take the case of tariff protection. This is the way which was resorted to by developed countries during the time of Industrial Revolution. They utilized heavy import duties to stop the import of goods from foreign countries. US did it to exclude Germany, Germany did it to exclude Britain, and each one of them did for each other. They utilized these tariff and quotas to grow their economy. And now once they are developed, they have access to technology, they have access to capital, and now they want developing countries to significantly reduce their tariff barriers. They want India to significantly reduce and continuously lower their import duties. And so we know that countries like India and other countries do not have industrial base. And at that point of time, if the import duty is significantly reduced, it leads to the import of cheaper products from foreign countries, and then which further deters the industrial growth. And the second reason why it is unfavorable to developing nations is the categorization of most favored nation by WTO. So under WTO agreement, countries cannot normally discriminate between their trading partners. So for example, they cannot grant someone a special favor such as a lower custom duty or rate, and if you do it for one, you will have to do it for others as well. So what does that mean? That means that if India is providing special treatment to a third country A, it will have to provide the same treatment to company from USA, a company from China. And that is a problem because companies from USA and China are pretty strong, right? Negotiating at WTO or any of its meetings require a very high level of specialized and technical knowledge of not just the law, but also about nuances of trade and economy, which developing countries generally do not have. And since they do not have that kind of human resource which can negotiate on their behalf, more often than not, the agreements, especially for African countries, are designed against them. And of course, when it is unfavorable to developing countries, in more aspects, it is favorable to developing nations. Because the way negotiations have been designed or the way agreements work, they enable various kinds of protection. And these protections are applicable only for developed countries. Let's take the agreement on agriculture, which is the framework which governs the farm subsidies of WTO, which is the agreement of WTO which governs the farm subsidies. It has categorized the farm subsidies into trade distorting domestic subsidies and non-trade distorting subsidies. So all those subsidies which are trade distorting shall have to be eliminated, whereas all which are not trade distorting can go on. So all trade distorting subsidies are categorized under amber box, whereas non-trade distorting subsidies are categorized under blue and green boxes. And so under WTO, these are allowed. An interesting fact is that most developed nations provide their farmers with the kinds of subsidies which are categorized under this box, whereas the way India or the way other developing nations provide subsidies to their farmers have been categorized under trade distorting, and it is a pressure on them to put an end or at least reduce these subsidies, which of course is in favor of developed nations. Then recently, there has been a push for change in definition of developing country under the principle of special and differential treatment. So which talks about upgrading certain developing countries from the status of developing. And this is going to deeply impact not just India, but many other countries like China, Egypt, Turkey, as well as South Africa. And the reason behind this is that there is an assumption that these countries have benefited immensely from WTO rules since its formation in 1995. And there is also a belief that these countries have progressed enough that they should not be getting benefits of a developing country. And so that is also going to act in favor of developed nations. Then a very important and a good thing about WTO is that all decisions are made on consensus. There is no concept of voting, and unless and until all the members agree to a particular agreement, that shall not come into force. That is a good thing, but that itself has become the biggest roadblock in the progress of WTO. Since the members of WTO are clearly divided between developed, or you can say global north versus global south, there has been a lack of development on any of the major agreements in last 20 years. And there is a fragmentation among countries. So for example, developed countries want to push their agenda with respect to rules on e-commerce, investment, intellectual property rights. But exactly on these agenda, developing countries are quite reluctant. Similarly, developing countries want to push for reform of agreement on agriculture, which developed countries are not interested because they already are having a lot of benefits from that. Then there are other issues as well. For example, agreement on trade related aspects of intellectual property rights, or acronymed as TRIPS, which is an international legal agreement between all the member nations of WTO with respect to rules regarding protection of intellectual property rights. For example, protection of patents, copyrights, logos, and various other such creations for companies from one country into another. It establishes minimum standards for regulation by national governments of different forms of IP. And it has been mainly criticized by developing countries because of its discriminatory nature. Because it is discriminatory in nature. Why is it discriminatory? Because most of the intellectual properties are owned by countries which belong to developed world. And now they want to sell their products in developing countries but want their IPRs to be protected at the same level as they are protected in developed countries. And now this is leading to creation of artificial scarcity of products, which can be okay in some cases but cannot be good in various fields. For example, in medical fields, in pharmaceuticals. Let's take an example of a medicine. Let's say if India has weak IPR laws and if a company somehow manages to develop the same medicine which is being sold in America and it starts the manufacturing. That is not possible right now, but at least it is going to save a lot of lives. But with imposition of strict TRIPS laws, only company A, which originally manufactured that medicine, is allowed to sell products in the developing countries as well. Then the next issue arises from dispute resolution mechanism of WTO. Dispute settlement system, or DSS, is a mechanism to resolve trade dispute between and among member states. The members of DSS are also appointed by consensus. And so if one of the member blocks the appointment, it shall become dysfunctional, and it has become dysfunctional since 2019 because of a lot of trouble being created by United States, which has led to very low number of judges to produce rulings. There are just not enough judges to produce rulings, and it has led to a huge backlog of cases pending in DSS. And finally, when the countries grow very powerful, they start resorting to unilateral tariffs. If you are reading newspaper, you must have read that in past 2 to 3 years, how China and USA have unilaterally imposed various kinds of tariffs on each other products without paying heed to the rules and procedures of WTO. Similarly, in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic, many countries including India have resorted to protectionism despite WTO in existence. So clearly you can understand that challenges in front of WTO are not small. There are mega challenges which the new Director General would have to face. So in this regard, in this discussion, we started by first understanding the context in which the parent body or the predecessor of WTO was formed, that is GATT. That context was extreme protectionism, to counter which a GATT was established, which then passed on the baton to WTO. Then we understood what advantages have been arrived, how it has worked in favor of increasing the global trade, but nonetheless it has its fair share of challenges and issues which needs to be resolved pretty soon. Let us now move on to the next discussion. The last article for discussion that we have taken deals with economy. Bad loans at record low, but write-offs still in the mix. So just 4 years ago, Indian banks' non-performing assets ratio was the worst among most emerging economies. NPAs are the bad loans which the borrower is not in a position to repay at the moment. While a loan turns bad or becomes an NPA if it is overdue or it is unpaid for over 90 days. But then, It's not as simple as it might sound. There are a lot of terms associated with the banking system which you must know. Also, it is just not purely an academic exercise. 2018 is the evidence for that, because in 2018 UPSC had asked questions which dealt with terms like capital adequacy ratio is the amount that banks have to maintain in the form of their own funds to offset any loss that banks incur if the account holders fail to repay dues. Second statement, that CAR is decided by each individual bank, was obviously incorrect. Only the first statement is correct, leading us to the right answer A, one only. And so there are a lot of terms which you should be aware of. Non-performing asset was defined by the newspaper itself. An asset that is not returning in the form of principal or interest during the last 90 reporting days is classified as NPA. Whereas gross non-performing asset is an absolute amount which reflects the total value of non-performing assets for the bank in particular financial year. While it is different from net NPAs or non-performing assets net NPA, which subtracts the provisions made by the bank for gross NPA. Hence, net NPA gives you the exact value of non-performing assets after the bank has made specific provisions for it. Now, if you don't know the meaning of the term provisions, this means that the bank sets aside a prescribed amount of money from their profit to compensate for probable loss. So, if a bank estimates that 100 crore worth of non-performing assets may turn bad, may not lead to any kind of EMI payment, then they are going to keep certain amount of profit to take care of the loans turning bad in order to make them foolproof in the coming financial year. Return of asset or RAO is calculated by dividing the net income of a bank by its total assets. Hence, this ratio greater than 1 is generally considered good. And you can see the provisioning is written over here. Whereas capital adequacy ratio is defined as the proportion of the bank's total assets that is held in the form of shareholders' equity and certain other defined classes of capital. It is a measure of the bank's ability to meet the needs of its depositors and other creditors. It is expressed as a percentage of bank's weighted credit exposures. A few welcoming trends have appeared in the banking sector. From the peak GNPA of around 11 to 12%, the GNPA has come down to 3.9% and net NPA has come down to 1%. Now you can see that ROA greater than 1% shows good things, is moving in that direction. Now, what can be considered as some of the reasons for declining NPAs? One, of course, is that insolvency and bankruptcy code has helped the recovery of sick loans. Banks have stopped lending big money to industries and increased their share of personal loans. There has been drop in the slippage ratio. The slippage ratio is the rate at which good loans are turning bad. The banks voluntarily choose to write off NPAs to maintain healthy balance sheets. According to the data given by the Finance Ministry, banks had written off bad loans worth 10,09,511 crore in last 5 years. And so these are the factors which have resulted in declining NPAs.